Our second spotlight faculty is Carolyn St. Peter. Dr. Carolyn St. Peter has been teaching at MCC since 2003. She teaches introductory psychology, psychological disorders, introduction to forensic psychology, and research methods. Prior to teaching, she was a staff psychologist for the Department of Veterans Affairs, doing psychological evaluations for claims of disabilities related to mental disorders and treatment of patients with psychological symptoms related to medical conditions. So Carolyn, are you comfortable with me projecting your slides, or would you prefer?
I think you're going to have to. Yeah.
There we go. A nice smooth transition.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for asking me to speak as a follow-up to Nicole's discussion on the topic of human subjects research and its applications for students at MCC. If you have a student that wants to conduct research with human participants, or if you want to incorporate human subjects into part of your classroom instruction, then I'm hoping after this presentation you'll feel confident about how and when to use the process. Those are mostly the questions that I get. How do I use the process and when do I use the process? So if you could advance the slide. I would like to start with a little overview of how the human subjects review process is structured in the district. I realize my bio is all clinically focused because I kind of see that as part of my identity. So how did I get involved in research? Well, I was involved with the setting up of the IRB and getting it registered through the federal government early on. It was started when I first came here, maybe 2003 or so. And I'm not sure the year that it was actually registered, maybe the mid 2000s sometimes, but during some time in the mid 2000s. But the psychology department has always reviewed our projects, even if it was informally. So now there's a formal mechanism for doing that. So the IRB, or Institutional Review Board, is housed at the district, and it's the main mechanism for providing oversight into ethical treatment of human participants in research. And it's kind of the mothership. Lutfi Hussein from English at MCC is the chair, and the administrator's name is Cindy Almendarez. She's the administrator. And then each college, as you can see, has its own subsidiary branch, which is called the CRRC, or the College Research Review Committee. And the chair of each CRRC is also a member of the IRB. And they review all of their own student projects on their own campuses. External researchers and faculty make their applications directly to the district. They submit applications through an electronic system called eProtocol, but the student process is a little bit different. And you can also see that at MCC, at Mesa, our little box looks a little bit different. It's a little unique. We have that little extra box dangling down there. That's what I chair, is the student CRRC at Mesa. And we have a separate review process for student projects here that works a little differently at MCC for a couple of reasons. One is because our CRRC chair, who is Lutfi, is also head of the IRB, so he doesn't have as much time to review the student projects. But more importantly, Mesa actually accounts for at least half of the applications submitted to the IRB for review. And our student applications are also high volume relative to the other colleges. So really from the very beginning, we've always had that little extra student review process. So go to the next slide, please. Under what conditions would you submit an application to the student CRRC for review? Well, there's really two main considerations. One is, do you have student-led human subjects research? And the other is a question about whether your student's project falls into federally defined categories of expedited or exempted projects. The first consideration, student-led, that's pretty easy. Is it a project that is originating from the student And is it human subjects research? That's pretty easy to define as well, at least the human part. If you're interacting or collecting data from human participants, it meets that part. But the other question you would need to ask yourself is this actually research? Research, as defined federally, is the gathering of information or data in a systematic way to draw generalizable conclusions or otherwise develop or add to a body of knowledge. If research is intended to be shared publicly, it is research. If it's intended to be shared publicly on a website, a conference, or a publication, then it should go before a review board. Well, because students, it's kind of questionable, are they actually adding to a body of scientific knowledge? On our committee in the psychology department, we've generally interpreted that to mean, does the student intend to publicly present their findings? That's a very liberal definition, which tends to probably over-capture student projects for review. But we just generally decided and kind of set the norm, 15, 20 years ago, that it would be better to over capture than under capture. So that's one of the main ways we discriminate between students who should probably go through the process and who maybe don't need to. However, under that definition of research, and this is a question I get a lot, it does not generally include classroom activities. So if you are just assigning students a project in order to collect data from other human beings, if they're just presenting it in class or doing it as a way for you to teach them about the research process, they would not have to go through the CRRC review. So that includes other things too, like program evaluation or, internal reviews of programs, political opinion polls, things like that, teaching evaluations. Those are not considered to be human subjects research. So in general, questions that focus on things, products, or policies are generally not considered human subjects research, nor are observational studies of public behavior. That is not considered human subjects research. The second issue to consider is whether your project could be considered to be described as expedited or exempt. There's kind of a wordy definition of exempt, what qualifies as an exempt application. And there are multiple conditions under which a project might be considered exempt from full board review. But most of our projects that we review meet the criteria that in order for it to be exempt, it has to use survey procedures in which participants cannot be identified. So if the participant responses are anonymous, it meets that criteria. And if any disclosure were to occur, there would be no reasonable risk to the participants. That is almost all the projects that I review. So in other words, if I have a student now that's working on a project. She wants to collect data from other students about whether they use laptops or handwritten notes in the classroom. And she wants to examine the relationship between that and academic achievement. Well, she's not going to be able to trace the data back to the individual respondents because it's anonymous, and the responses to those questions would be minimal risk. So that's an example of an expedited or an exempt project. An expedited project is when participants are identifiable. So the researcher could link the responses or the recorded behaviors back to the participants, but the activities place the participants at minimal risk, and it falls into one of several categories in federal regulations which limit the activities to certain things. One of those certain things that federal regulations includes is research on individual or group characteristics or behaviors. So in other words, it's pretty much the same as exempt, the difference being that you can identify the participants, but again, the research activities are a minimal risk to the participants. So an example of that, I have this kind of thing all the time. A student will want to do an experimental study where they have a treatment condition where participants engage in some kind of relaxation exercise, and then they have a control group where they don't. Those participants are, identifiable to the researcher, but they're comparing those two groups across something like test anxiety. Again, they can trace it back, the responses back to the participants, but if those questions were disclosed, they place the participant at minimal risk. So next slide, please. So if you decide based on those criteria that you need to go through the process and your activities meet those definitions, the main thing that faculty and students always want to know from me is the timeline. For projects that are exempt or expedited, it's usually pretty quick. That means they don't have to go to full board review. I and one other reviewer, it requires 2 reviewers, have to review each project. I can usually get it done in 2 or 3 days, but the full timeline is kind of subject to the time of this other, whoever the second reviewer is. I have a few that I can call upon. But I would say usually plan for at most about a week after you submit the application. The other thing you need is some materials. And if you could go to this link, I'll show you what the materials would be. You need to submit 2 things. You need to submit an application form, and you have to complete a training. So if you can see kind of at the top of this website, if you scroll to the top, it refers faculty, staff, and external applicants to the district. And then the student applications have to be turned into the psychology department. So if you click on the link at left for the application process, that's where you can find the form. Okay, and so that's the form that you would complete. And you can submit that form to me. It looks like this. It's a fillable form in Word. It looks very complicated, but it's really not. It just asks you for a summary of the project and some questions about whether you feel it's exempt or expedited. So then if you go back to the link, Human Subjects Research Training Certification, there you'll find instructions on how to take the training course that all applicants to the process must complete. And it gives you a certificate that then you would submit along with your application. Who has to take the training? Well, the faculty sponsor has to take the training. The student completing the project who's leading the project has to take the training. And any other students or helpers who would come into contact with either participants or with the data that comes from the project.
Carolyn, just one more minute and then we'll do questions.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. Last slide. I just want to give you an overview of common uses and examples of this process. Obviously, as Nicole mentioned, honors projects are a big source of projects that we review, but there are also students from classes who want to submit their projects for contests or poster presentations. We have a symposium in the psychology department where they participate, student showcases, and that kind of thing. But also I get a lot of applications to review from research-based courses. That's actually how I use the process mostly. My labs reflect the steps in conducting human subjects research. And so they go from all the way from finding an idea to developing a hypothesis to writing a consent form. And so some students then decide they want to use their projects outside of the classroom. And so then those are the students that would go through the CRRC review process. Besides reviewing projects, I also do a lot of consultation on the process. So if you have any questions, you can always email me, contact me, or Lutfi Hussein, and I'll be able to help you through the process if necessary. So also, if you have any questions now, I'll be happy to answer them.
Questions for Carolyn? I don't have a comment. Is I think it would be fabulous if if students who were engaging in maybe the special projects, research projects, or some other course-based projects, maybe would be advised or encouraged to take your course also, right? This is a way where we could kind of reinforce some of the work they're doing. You're doing that work with going through the training, the human research training and whatnot. So I think there's some opportunities there maybe to let students know that this could be complementary to some of their work that they're doing in their other classes.
Right, especially some of the other courses that I mentioned on there, like I review a good number of applications from anthropology, some from political science. Of course, it's mostly psychology since we deal in human participants, but exercise science has also been a common utilizer of the process because a lot of times they'll want students to collect data on like health behaviors and that kind of thing. Some group projects have come to me through exercise science that have been really good projects, and then they went on to present them at student showcases.